All right, everyone, it's time to come back to your seats. We have our next panel about to start. We're going to have so much time for networking. The food is coming, so there'll be time to eat and talk. So please just have your seats so that we can continue with the show for today. Is our next moderator available? Okay, she's right here. I can see her. Ada, please come forward. Our next speakers, I see Samson Itodo at the back of the hall. I see the beautiful Chineye, my namesake, also in front. I don't know, you don't have to come up yet. I think the moderator will call. No, moderator, come, but you're going to introduce your speakers one after the other, so. Okay, so you want me to announce them? Oh, okay. So, I'm just going to pull up. Thank you so much. Please come in. We have so much time to network in between the break and during the end of when we have our refreshments. So we have an important panel, a very, very important panel coming up. And it's about strengthening institutions in Africa and building the right foundation for development and inclusive growth. The moderator is the beautiful Adobe Eboka, who is our host, you know, with the Van Center. We have a powerhouse, a mover and shaker in the civic space in Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo, who is the founder of Yega Africa. I'm sure you all have heard about the Not Too Young to Run bill. It was a bill that reduced the age for people to be able to participate in politics, to become governors, to become House of Rep members. We also have the beautiful Chineye, my namesake. I think Chineyes were created on a special day, because look at that. Yeah, come up. Chineye is with the National Endowment for Democracy. She's the head of grants for Africa. So we talked about giving and philanthropy earlier on. So that's an organization that gives to projects around governance, democracy in Africa. We have Bamikole Omishore, also known as Banks. He's also a young mover and shaker in the civic space, in the political space. He's worked with the former Senate President of Nigeria, and right now he's a special advisor to a governor in Nigeria as well. So I'm going to the moderator will let them introduce themselves. We also have someone who is meant to be joining us virtually, but he sent in a video because, you know, we thought because of technical challenges and stuff, it would be best to have videos as opposed to having Zoom participation. So Prof Kofi is a lawyer in Ghana. He's doing amazing things in that space. We have another panelist. I don't know if she's in the room. Do we have Mayowa in the room? Oh, amazing. I didn't even see you earlier. I don't have my glasses. Mayowa is a partner at McKinsey. So she's going to bring perspectives from the consulting space, and she's also going to talk more about herself. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to our able moderator to do justice to this conversation. And I hope that you all would also participate. And yes, we'll take it from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So, thank you. So many of you in the room will agree with me that Africa is a land of remarkable beauty, with lots of potentials. As we heard from the first, I was listening to the first panel and I'm like, oh my God, there's so much talent, so much to do from what we heard from the first panel. And we know that despite all this, the lack of credible institutions in Africa has far-reaching and detrimental consequences for many of us. We know that addressing these challenges is a complex and long-term endeavor, which would take a lot of years to do. But on this panel today, we're looking at the role of how do we strengthen institutions. And then I think about the role of effective and transparent institution in any democracy cannot really be overemphasized. We know that if Africa must grow and be in line with the AU's Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want, we must first strengthen our institutions, establish effective, responsive, and democratic institutions, which is very critical for not just the growth, but reducing poverty in Africa. And I also think about it additionally, SDG 16 focuses on really looking at people's lives, reducing violence, improving access to justice, promoting effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. And really, as we think about it, we know that strong institutions are essential foundation for any sustainable development goal. Is vital for any rule of law and economic development. So we really cannot talk about our theme today, which is African economic empowerment, without looking at our institutions. And on that note, I have great experts in the room. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes really looking at how do we explore ways to strengthen institutions in Africa and building the right foundation for development and inclusive growth. My panelists are specialists in the field, as you've heard. I'll allow them introduce themselves, and I'm grateful to them for making time despite their very busy schedules to be here with us. I'll start by just calling on them to first spend a minute or two, introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and what you do in 1 minute, and then we move to the core discussions. But I promise you that at the end of this discussion, we're hoping to have not just policy, legal, and policy law and other areas of recommendations. We're going to come out with core recommendations that will find ways to follow through beyond this. I'll start with you, Samson.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Samson Itodo, and I am African, and I work with an organization called Yaga Africa. And what we do is to help states build mutually constructive relationships with citizens. And this we do through our work on elections, engagement with legislature, as well as citizens' engagement. Thank you, and I'm so delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Samson, for that. Chinonye, please.
Am I audible? Great. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm super honored to be here. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Africa Policy Conversations for inviting me. I'm very, very happy, and I'm so happy also to see all of your wonderful faces here. First of all, can I also say that it is a very rare occurrence to see 3 Chineyas in the room. So for me and my 2 namesakes, I'm so happy. Very, very rare occurrence. So as mentioned, I work in grants administration at the National Endowment for Democracy based in Washington, D.C. I cover a grants portfolio for the Africa region. I'm extremely passionate about building and strengthening democracy in Africa, and I work quite a lot with grassroots organizations in a number of countries across the continent. I'm also a consultant, and my current focus is blockchain adoption and facilitating cross-border payments from outside of Africa into Africa.
Thank you. Mayawa, please.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes, please.
Private sector, so I really hope I have something to contribute in terms of policy. I am a partner based out of the Lagos office. I lead the work that we do. There we go. I lead the work that we do in the financial services space across the region. That's my day job. I also have a little bit of a side hustle where I lead our economic research for Africa. You might have read some of our publications. We've been doing that for about 15 years. The first one was called Lions on the Move. The latest one came out in August this year. It has no savanna animals because we were tired of people asking us, will the lions ever move? So hopefully I can bring some insight from there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bamikole Omishore. I was a special advisor to the former Senate President, so I think that qualifies me to be on the same panel with Samson. I did a lot of work with Samson while we were in the Senate, which was an institution on its own. Now I'm currently with the governor of Osun State, a member of the cabinet. So I'm here to speak from a legislative perspective and slightly on the executive arm as well, since we just formed the cabinet a couple of months ago. It's a pleasure to be here, and I see some of my old colleagues from National Assembly in Yako in the room. I look forward to at least exchanging ideas. Thank you.
No, thank you so very much. So thank you to my panelists for introducing themselves. And Mayo, I'm singling you out because I hear you talk about the private sector and you being the only one here, even though I know you're not. So for me, when I thought about this topic, what I was thought about was if we must talk about strengthening institutions, I think it would be very important for us to first look at what are the really issues on ground. So we can't just be bandying the words strengthening institutions without looking at what are the fundamental issues. So I think it would be great to hear from you what you think are the prevalent issues surrounding poor institutions, because if we must get to adherence of the rule of law, then we should address those issues.
So very interesting question. Part of the work we did, and it took us 1.5 years actually to write, in fact 2 years, to write the report. It's completely funded by partners at McKinsey. There's no external money into the work that we do. Was we took a long-term view of what was happening across Africa, right? And we looked at the last 60 years and we looked at the last 30 years. One of the things that shocked me to find out, well, you live it, but when you see the numbers, it becomes very real, was that between 1960 and 2019, we stopped at 2019 because of COVID, Africa as a continent has only increased GDP per capita by 1.1%. 1.1%. That is how much people's lives have increased over the last 60 years. And we looked at, 60 because of the independence movement around that time. You then sort of look at the last 30 years, right? You looked at what happened between 1990 and 2000, 2000 and 2010, and then 2010 and 2030. And the picture doesn't change very much. Oh, sorry, you can't hear. The picture doesn't change very much. We're still first of all, we're still a continent that is growing much slower than our population, right? We're a continent that is highly dependent on resources. We're a continent that is perhaps, very sadly, not very interconnected. You look at how we trade with ourselves. We trade more with Europe. We trade more with the United States than we trade with ourselves. Inter-African trade is 16% today, right? So you see all of these things and you realize that, you live, because I live in Nigeria, you live this thing, but you look at the numbers and you think to yourself, this doesn't make sense. It is it's very burdensome. I'm having conversations now with clients who are not Nigerian, and the first question they ask me is, what is happening in West Africa, right? The number of people, the population, and the percentage of our economic output that is now in regions that are sort of, I want to use very careful terms, but regions where there's been an undemocratic shift in government has significantly increased over the last 10 years. The countries that have inflation, countries that have, I can go on and on and on and on and on about all the numbers and all the things that are sort of our lived reality on the continent. And I think these are some of the things that are the product of the fact that we're sort of living in well, I don't want to use broad sweeping statements, but we are in a jurisdiction where, like you said, policy and the rule of law is not necessarily followed.
No, thank you so much. So I hear you, the idea that our per capita has been on 1.1% for so long. And then I think about it, so that's one aspect of it, looking at how development hasn't really gone so well over the years. I'm going to move to this side and just ask Samson. Samson, I know you've been doing a lot in terms of trying to get the youth involved, trying to really get policies in place. What have you seen that you say that is still the issue on ground in terms of talking about institutional growth?
Well, thank you very much. So there are three types of institutions on the continent, and I note that on this panel we have perhaps all Nigerians, so I'll try not to Nigerianize the conversation. And so I'll resist the temptation, and my intervention will be based on a scan of what the region actually projects. The first category of institutions we have, and first to make the point that when we talk about institutions, we're not necessarily looking at, bodies or government institutions. We're looking at norms, practices that shape how states, are run and how citizens engage with the state. First, there are dead institutions on the continent. There are some institutions that have lost their life. And so if you look at South Africa, you look at Uganda, you look at some parts of Nigeria, there are some institutions that actually come to mind. So the first one, if you see policing, for instance, if you look at the justice system, because from the last panel, we can't talk about Africa's transformation if justice becomes the most expensive commodity that ordinary citizens cannot access. So that's one category of institutions, dead institutions. They've lost life. The second category of institutions we have on the continent are malnourished institutions. These are institutions that are not they're not manned with individuals with the requisite capacity or the moral capital to manage the operations of those institutions. Or you have existing laws and policies that twist the institution to not deliver on its mandate, but instead serve the interests of the elite. So they are subjected to the whims and caprices, of political leaders. The third category of institutions, in my view, are what you might consider well-fed institutions. And sadly, these institutions are not well-fed because they seek to advance public interest. And one of them are political parties across the continent. They are well-fed because you have hegemons, who determine who has access, to power and who has access to the spoils or the dividends of democracy. And so if you look across Africa, these are the kinds of institutions that you find. And the reason is, if we don't address the question which was posed in the last session about what kind of values should shape how we structure our institutions and what kind of individuals go into those institutions. Because you can strengthen institutions if you wish, but institutions are not enough. You need human beings who uphold certain values to run those institutions, and then the institutions have self-correcting mechanisms that helps in curtailing excesses where people who man those institutions, act in manner that does not advance public interest. So if you look across the continent, this is what you find. And my last thought is, if we're going to transform the continent, then we need to fix our institutions, whether public or private.
Great point. So I hear dead institution, I hear malnourished institution, and I hear well-fed institution. And you think about it, you see justice, you see capacity, you see political parties, very essentials in the ecosystem of every democracy and country. Actually, that kind of brings me to, yes, I'm thinking about this, because I know that he has talked about one thing that Samson said, he has talked about, so we're not just looking at the institutions itself, we're looking at the human beings and the values that we find. And so as I think about it, I think about the human beings, transparency, accountability, structures in place. I have projects in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, different places. And as I move around these places, I see, you kind of feel the differences in the institutions and how that affects human rights, how that affects social welfare for the citizens. I just want to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't know whose idea it was to put me next to Samson, because I don't even know how to speak after that. But it's also funny because Samson's a partner, Yaga Africa is a partner of ours, so I feel like this is a brother sitting next to me. You know, I could parrot a lot of what Samson has already mentioned, and I don't think it would even sort of summarize all that we've basically been trying to discuss, not even just here, but on the sidelines with other Africa events. You know, when we talk about the social contract, right, I'm sure that you've heard the term or the expression social contract, where basically you have a set of agreements or rules that a government and governed people pretty much agree to. And what we have seen across Africa is a erosion or a complete breaking or breakdown of that social contract, where governments have more or less decided not to adhere to what they've agreed on. So citizens have pretty much felt betrayed by their own governments. And that is basically what we have seen all across Africa. When you look at the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, African countries continue to rank the lowest on that index, with the exception of Botswana and Namibia. And as you mentioned, across my portfolio right now, I currently manage a portfolio of grants covering Somaliland, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Kenya, but I've also worked on Gambia, Sierra Leone. They won't let me work on Nigeria, and I don't know why. They said I'm too emotional, but whatever. So, and we're seeing very, very similar situations. You're seeing a lack of transparency. You're seeing, in terms of government, in terms of institutions, you're seeing a lack of accountability. You're seeing a lack of media freedom. You're seeing citizens having to take power into their own hands. And that is now producing people like Samson and people like Renu, who's sitting in front of me, who are trying to stand in the gap, where institutions are failing, where they're breaking down, people, civil society, nonprofits, they end up standing in the gap and doing the role that they actually weren't really meant to do. That is all due to this broken social contract. So ultimately, we do see similar situations across Africa, and it is quite unfortunate that you don't really put Africa and democracy in the same sentence. Because when you look at democratic principles of protection and promotion of human rights,
and you're saying you're too good, you're too pretty, you don't want to mess your leg up, and you allow the next batch of 12 to play the game, you're not going to get your best results. So which goes back to the basics of while we were in National Assembly, yes, you need to be rugged to win elections, but the capacity to run governance is different from winning an election. And that's why, we did some good work with Yaga while we were in National Assembly. And I think to build strong institutions, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals of creating an enabling environment for peace and justice, we need to address the rule of law. And how do we address rule of law if our politicians don't have the capacity to drive some of these changes? So first thing first is getting more people that are enlightened. That's why I passionately supported the Not Too Young to Run. I think in the last 8 years, things have moved a little bit. We have more enlightened people getting into public office, more accessible. When you're accessible, you get to get the feedback to drive these changes. And I speak in the context of Nigeria in this sense. And to build stronger institutions, I think we must address poverty and hunger. Why is that? You cannot build a strong institution if politicians believe, I don't have to work for the next 4 years after being elected, which is based on, you were talking about social contract. When they know they can give 2,000, 3,000 naira or less than $2, $3 to win an election. So we must go back to the drawing board and see how do we improve the quality of people that come into different political posts, different institutions, be it your National Assembly, be it your government. And the least functional institution in Nigeria is also the local government. All the jobs that, even with the local government autonomy being passed, we still see a lot of states that are driving their budget, running their budget. So in my context, I think one of the biggest things we need to do to perform at utmost performance, that includes training, which you guys is doing, not just at elections, but also the level of education and change of orientation of people that actually do go into office. And also talking about institutions would be people trying to have a sit-down syndrome that we see across all Africa. No matter how good of a president, of a governor you could be, trying to elongate your stay in office affects the institution itself. So we must begin to have that conversation is even the best of persons, how do we get them to mentor the next generation to take over so that at least that knowledge, that expertise can be passed on to build more stronger institutions than building a one-man show, one-man army. I think I'll leave on that for now.
No, thank you. So garbage in, garbage out. And really, you say you can't give what you don't have. So it's not just about having elections and having the right people in those places, but really having people who are enlightened, people who have the quality of what it takes to govern. And then thinking about a bottom-up approach, making sure that we're covering the very local levels that matter. I'm going to just announce that this is a very interactive panel. I'm not going to wait to the end to get questions. So if you have any comments, contribution, just feel free to raise your hand at any point, and I'm going to jump in, because for us, we want to exchange and learn. So I see your hand, please.
I need to speak louder? Okay. Thanks for getting it to chill down in here a little bit. Yona, from Boston. A huge interest in doing some manufacturing in Senegal, West Africa. In December, with some of the I think this mic is consistent.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
good.
hear you.
So I'm listening to you all talk about these institutions, right? These institutions that are dysfunctional, that are really controlling the country. And really, it's a power construct that I see, because when I was in Senegal, I saw that we, all men, who I met with, all men, but when religion or culture is the forefront of the institution back. And then there's I just wonder how much of this changed from getting and eradicating Europe and China investments that are actually controlling, as they do in America. Corporations are controlling the government. And so you can organize the people, you can educate the people, but what leverage do the people have when you're dealing with resources, power, and money? And so the president's got the military. Might train someone to come up for this new government position. Some presidents don't even step down after they're voted out. So what are the other, what's happening in the west side of Africa? I'm concerned about so what's happening in the west side of Africa, where we are creating a system to help eradicate the hands choking the country.
Thank you. So I'm going to keep on that first. If I come to the next person, I see hands up. I'm going to stay on that.
I recommend we take
I'll
that
take
way
all the
helps us.
questions at once if it's going to be 2 seconds, not less than 1 minute, please. Because I know this, we're running out of time, yes. So straight to the question, keep sharp, and then I pick it up, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yamando Alexander from the African Fund. Hearing the panel, by the way, very interesting. My question is, as we read the geopolitical landscape right now with so many coups from Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, lately Gabon, and how ECOWAS is suddenly getting so worried, I will say, and trying to send army into Niger to try to restore a president that is long gone. what is in what you're thinking and what you're pushing for the promotion of democracy when we see actually a reverse, that democracy in the last 50, 60 years didn't work for the people?
Interesting. I'll take one there, then I'll get back to my panelists.
To the back?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll take, yeah, she.
Thank you very much. My name is Linda Bonyo. I am a lawyer based out of Kenya, and I work on digital laws. So I run an organization called Lawyers Hub, and there are two things that I want to just bring to the fore from what I've seen. I like the work that Diego is doing, and I had the opportunity to observe the Nigerian elections. And I'm surprised by the inability for us in the continent to draw patterns from what's happening across the African continent. I think we're so siloed in our approaches that we can't necessarily see what happens. For instance, it's very easy to guess what's going to happen next in the next African elections. From how elections are stolen to the way they ideally get to the end, how disinformation works on platforms, and then also how people go to court and challenge election results, and then eventually how they're announced. This has happened before in different countries, and we can see it. How do we learn from these patterns? Number two, how do we fund organizations when our budget is foreign? Kenya's, for example, digital budget, education budget is funded by the British. And so what the British wants, ideally, we will do it, even when we don't know or don't want it. And so as we talk about new technologies like AI, and we're trying to redesign institutions and saying that data protection commissions don't necessarily have to be AI regulators, but we can't do it on an African budget because we can't afford to redesign institutions. How do we do that? Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So I've opened the floodgates. So I'm seeing questions. I'm going to come back to you. I want to, because the things that have come out of here that are very important. And majority of what I hear is West Africa, what is happening? Coups that we are seeing, what is going on? What are the patterns that we are seeing where elections takes place? So I'm from Nigeria, disclaimer, I'm sure you'd have seen from my accent. People say, oh, just go to court. We're seeing a lot of places where the judiciary is making decisions on elections now, and not just the vote counting anymore. And Mayo, Chineye, I'm going to come to you. I hear about funding and how funding dictates the tone. So I'm going to get to you for that, to tell us in terms of when you are funding, what do you think? But before I do that, something I know you've been so involved in, maybe tell folks who are not from Nigeria what the Not Too Young to Run is about, quickly, and then how do you see us changing the dynamics? Is it that we don't have the right people, or we don't have the right institutions, or the institutions are not functional? What really is the missing piece of what's happening in West Africa? People have argued that people see the patterns and the trends where constitutions are changed, elections are not honored, we go to court, and that is the particular trend we're seeing. So what is the missing piece? No, Samson, please.
Okay. So the Not Too Young to Run was a campaign led by young people in Nigeria to reduce the age for running for office, because at the time, I think till date, the average age for African president was somewhere around 64. And that's a continent, as you know, we're a young continent, where you have old and expired politicians maintaining political power at the expense of their people. And so the Constitution reduced the age for running for office thanks to the likes of banks and other legislators. So that's what Not Too Young to Run is. But I think to this vexed question about the unconstitutional changes of government, and just to tie these two interventions, first, the pandemic of discontent that you see expressed on the streets of Mali, Guinea, Niger, and Gabon is just driven by the failure of political leaders to deliver the dividends of democracy to the people. And when you see young people celebrate, they're not celebrating military, dictatorship per se. They're just in a quest for what? For alternatives. And it's alternatives that put food on the table, that gives them access to quality education. So long as political leaders, don't address these challenges, then people are just going to clamor for these alternatives. And so what we need to do is first, our regional institutions, like the African Union, like ECOWAS, they have been too reactive for too long. When political leaders steal elections, these same institutions legitimize those elections. And you think people are stupid? People are watching when the ECOWAS rises up and say, oh, the Sierra Leonean election. Because we know what happened with the Sierra Leonean election that held few months ago. So these institutions need to rise to the occasion. Secondly, we need political education. We've got to educate our people, you know, to appreciate the fact that democracy does not begin and end with elections. That there's a lot of work that happens after elections, and that is the work of holding leaders to account. That you don't have to wait, you know, for another round of elections to hold them to account. So that kind of political education. And thirdly is the fact that, honestly, we need to rethink our leadership recruitment process. If a seat in parliament is a reward for sycophancy, you're going to have people who don't have the capacity to legislate in our parliaments, in our state houses. That's how you have Mugabes everywhere in the continent, because people perpetuate themselves in office and they don't want to leave. And so people are tired. So we've got to change our leadership recruitment process. So only people who have the competence, the character, and capacity, you know, can run for office. And to my sister from Senegal, Senegal remains a shining light for the continent. And it's a shining light for how collective power of the people can actually hold authoritarians to account. Macky Sall wanted to run for a third term. It took the people of Senegal to hold him to account. And it's not the first time. When Abdoulaye Wade wanted to change the constitution, they mobilized. And Yanama, which is the movement or citizens movement, did support that effort. And we see all of this actually happening. Because on the continent, I think the fact that citizens are still galvanizing and pushing against authoritarianism is something that gives me hope that there's actually light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I still see hands up. But I'm just wondering what to do, because I have my panelists that I really have so much to ask, and I'm seeing hands up. But I know the panelists are going to hang around. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much for that question for the two of you, and I will touch on yours, but I will focus primarily on yours. So, you know, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about the word corporate cronyism and how we have institutionalized corruption on a level that the average citizen has very little knowledge about. But based on your experience, you've been able to observe that there are corporate interests that are protected, and then the self-interests of those who are within positions of power, they keep that power amongst themselves, and at the end of the day, the people who basically lose out are the small businesses, the citizens in general. But as Samson mentioned, we can't underestimate the power of a collective call for accountability and transparency. The more information you have, the more you're able to collectively, as a citizenry, as a unit or as a nation, you are able to demand accountability and to sort of link the 2 points together. You said something that immediately when you said it, I was like, I don't think I would call any nation in Africa a democracy, because I'm looking at the democratic principles, and when I think about what democratic principles actually are, I can't touch on a country where I would say that this is a democracy in the true sense that I understand it to be. Democracy is not where you have leaders that are in power for 50 plus years, where you have 90-something-year-old leaders that continue somehow to be reelected with disputed elections, where you have the populace protesting outside that we do not want you in office anymore. You have leaders that are handing over power to their children. I wouldn't call that a democracy in any way whatsoever, where you have continually disputed elections, where you have people that are completely discriminated or they're shut out from the democratic processes, where you have the weaponization of tribe and religion and poverty, of course, we've already touched on that. I wouldn't call any of that a democracy. So I cannot say that there's a nation in Africa right now that I would characterize as a democracy. So when you said, with the uprisings, the coups, and I guess the unraveling of what seemed to be a semblance of something that looks like democracy, I would say, like Samson mentioned, they are looking for an alternative. And again, as we've probably discussed, maybe not here, but in other conversations, coups, civilian or military, are anti-democratic, they're undemocratic, they're wrong. But when you have the level of desperation we're witnessing, they are looking for anything else. We are tired of 47, 87-year-old people. We're tired of decades of rule. We're tired of you continually handing over power to you and your friends. You find out that the leaders, the government leaders, their children are married to the judicial leaders, and they're married and they're all basically, again, institutionally corrupt. So dismantling the system comes with active participation in democratic processes. And I can touch on the funding bit, maybe if not now, then later. We need to collectively have a barrage of people who are asking the right questions and participating in democratic processes, not just elections. You have constitutional reviews, you have hearings, Senate hearings, or legislative hearings in general. You have so many activities that most people do not know when they take place. They have no idea what they are. And so we do not have as much of an active citizenry as we should all across the continent. And I think once we start there, we can actually start looking at, are we upholding these democratic principles enough to even call this a democracy? Because as at now, I don't think so.
Okay, so before I continue, we have a panelist who couldn't be here in person, who is actually online. I'll crave your indulgence, so let's quickly hear from him as we continue. That's Professor Kofi Abotse.
Hi, I'm Adeze. I moved back from the UK in 2021, and since...
Distinguished invited guests and participants, I bring you warm greetings.
Institutions are important in the development of any society, and certainly in the conduct of commerce and international business. Not only have they been described as the rules of the game, but institutions also provide a predictable basis for conducting business and commerce generally. And therefore, institutions cannot be, the point cannot be overemphasized that institutions are important. Now, given that I have only 3 minutes, I'm going to therefore limit this. I'm not going to go into the details of the theory. So I'm going to limit my short presentation to the 2 key aspects of institutions and their importance to investment in Africa. And these 2 key aspects have to do with the need to synergize institutions and therefore harmonize institutions across the continent. And secondly, also to emphasize the rule of law dimensions of institutions. In terms of synergizing institutions, Africa contains of more than 50 countries. And these countries have varying rules and regulations and approaches for dealing with things. The reality of the colonial legacy in Africa has implied that Africa has been said to operate a fragmented commercial space, which means many countries, some of which do not have the requisite population to support an attractive investment environment, so to speak. These countries, so to speak, are not that competitive, but this situation is further compounded by the fact that they do have different institutional arrangements and different rule requirements for the conduct of business and therefore investment. So there may be the need to emphasize the issue of harmonization or synergizing the rules and regulatory approaches to operating institutions. One study, for example, has found that Africa operates more than 275 mobile wallets, and a similar study found that there are over 500 banks on the continent. While these of themselves are not bad, sometimes they do reflect the diversity of institutions and they do reflect the diversity of regulatory approaches, as investors tend to respond or having to respond to different regulatory requirements from country to country. So there may be the need to synergize and harmonize Africa's institution in order to reinforce the commonality of the market, particularly the new market being established under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AFCFTA. So it's important that we appreciate the specialty of institutions in terms of how they expand the prospects and the overall investment capacity of a continent such as Africa's that has different dynamics and the diversity of countries and approaches as far as the regulation to business and commerce is concerned. The second aspect, which has to do with the rule of law. One study finds, for example, that should Africa reinforce its rule of law and the role law plays generally in institutional dynamics, Africa will add $20 billion to its GDP. While that may appear not exactly as significant given the size of the African continent and given Africa's overall GDP, which has been estimated to be 3.3 and growing very quickly, it's important to appreciate how institutions can reinforce the attractiveness of the continent as a marketplace and as a destination of investment. And the World Bank has estimated, for example, that countries on the continent, and certainly that of Ghana, loses over $3 billion annually to corruption, for example. And this is a conservative figure that was indicated many years ago, which obviously must have grown bigger now. The deficit of the rule of law and its impact on a country's attractiveness as a destination of investment and as a retainer of investment can again be overemphasized in this particular context. So it's important and imperative that the role of institutions are, one, appreciated, but also two, properly deployed in the context of investment to ensure that that Africa is attractive as a destination of investment. But as I conclude, I would just like to emphasize that it's important to also look at investment from a broader and holistic perspective. This is not just international investment, even local investment. All investment require one fundamental thing, and that is the predictability of the ease of doing business and therefore the prospects of doing business, and also more crucially, the safety of investment itself. And I think that the role and importance of institutions in these respects cannot be overemphasized.
We're going to ask for them to round up as we end. I'll take one question there.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I think mine is really just a commentary, but along the lines of what Samson Itodo had spoken to on strengthening institutions. And to my mind, institutions don't work in isolation. They're made up of people who come from somewhere. So I think we should also pay attention to our family unit. It's also an essential part when these conversations come up. What kind of people are we raising? What kind of people are we associating? And how are some of these conversations influencing our world? Because when you look at the decadence in society today, it's very abnormal, for lack of a better word. Just how that if you're cultured in a certain way from where you come from, there are certain things you would naturally not do. You would hear people say things like, in our family, we do not do things like this. And that alone is enough mindset shift in how we operationalize our institutions and how we go about, when we talk about strengthening systems. I'm a very systems-focused person, and I can tell you for free that the reflection you see at work, at school, it's not so far from how people are where they come from. So I think in crafting some of this, we should also pay attention to what is the family unit made of in 2023 in Africa, and how does it impact the larger society? Thank you.
Thank you.
So two things. One, I hear success stories. Chinaya, I know I see hands, but my panelists are going to step down and they really have time to engage with them. I need to be mindful of other panels that are coming up. Someone is consistently putting his hand up.
One last person.
Okay.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Prameet. I'm from Boston, but I'm an Indian American. So recently, African Union has been added as a G21 member. And there is a lot of interest and there's a big summit in India that just concluded of G20, and now it will become G21 with African Union being part of it. So from India, I have seen there is a lot of interest of starting some big ventures in Africa, particularly in healthcare and agriculture. So one is in the agriculture. the whole world apart from Africa is looking for organic food, and there is so much of organic land and organic farming that we can do in Africa. So how we should move about, if you can give some thoughts around it. And second, in the healthcare sector, I myself have set up cancer centers in India, and I'm very keen on setting up cancer centers in Africa. So in those lines, if I could get some help in this forum. Thank you.
So you're in the right room. There's a due room coming up. So that's where you're going to hear lots of ideas coming from lots of people here in this room, and they will connect with you. I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to go around to my panelists. 2 questions. I think we're just going to go around with one first, then I'll go with the second one. So as I ask the first, I want to think about the second. So following Reno's question around success stories, so we just can't come here and talk about wrong things that are going on. What has worked? So we've talked about what hasn't worked. I know somebody called it civilian coups in Africa because we see it coming before it becomes a real coup. We've talked about the problems, institutions, we've mentioned all of them. But what has worked? From your experience in 2 minutes or 1 minute, tell us what has worked. Then after that, after I go through the round, I'll come back again to ask you, what is our takeaway from here? What policy implementation? What do you think we should do differently as a group, as individuals, as we think about promoting justice, good governance, transparency, the ease of doing business? But let's start with the first. What has worked for you, Mayowa, or success stories?
So I started with giving very grim statistics about our overall macroeconomic position. So I'll give maybe 2 numbers that give me a lot of comfort when I'm having conversations. The first is that half of Africa's population, right, half of the population actually lives in countries that are growing above average growth. So over the last 20 years, Africa has probably grown 4.5%. Half of the population of Africa lives in countries that are growing very quickly. So I know I started doing 1.1% economic growth since 1960s, but the picture of Africa is not the same. And I think that's something that's very, very important for us to internalize. And also, I know we always say Africa is not a country, but when we're talking about Africa to non-Africans, we always say Africa. But realizing that there is a differentiated growth path, there are differentiated growth outcomes across the continent gives me a lot of comfort and a lot of reasons to look at the glass half full, not half empty. The second stat I'm going to give you is something also that people are very surprised about, and I think it's also very important in the context of capital and thinking about what's happening in the corporate world. Africa has today 345 companies that's making over $1 billion. A lot of people, and this is not $1 billion valuation, it's $1 billion in revenue. When I ask people how many companies they think it is, people will tell me 10. These are Africans, or not even non-Africans. People say 10, people say 50. And your view on the continent, and I think the question was someone asked about investing and building businesses in Africa. The view on the continent changes if you think we have 350 companies that are making $1 billion than 50 making $1 billion. I think there's reason for optimism. There's reason to be hopeful. We can't only look at the bad things. I think they're also very, very. I try to call them bright spots. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about, because we just had a panel full of people, is just the innovation, the dynamism that we're seeing in the technology sector. I fundamentally believe that technology has a huge role to play in finding solutions, and we're seeing it. African homegrown solutions for African problems, and we're seeing it every day, and I think that gives me a lot of cause for optimism.
Thank you so much. So diversity, the idea, I didn't know this figure at all. It's shocking.
You can download my reports and read it.
Companies owned by Africa is actually worth $1 billion in revenue. So as you think about businesses coming to Africa, I'm sure that should be something to look out for.
So what has worked? For me, answering the question what has worked, I wouldn't answer it as a politician that has worked in National Assembly or state level, because first of all, I'm Nigerian. What has worked is, I believe the first thing is the most powerful office at the end of the day is the office of the citizen. In as much that we might not see it because we haven't really won the entire battle, but we are winning the war as we progress as a people. And I say that to say this. Gone are the days, to some extent. Reno asked that question, what has worked, right? And I'll tell you, the NSAS was a big success to some level. Why? It got politicians to sit up, politicians across different political parties. Now, you see Nigerians talking on social media, yelling about this, yelling about that. Beyond that, their kids are also telling them, Daddy, they are coming for us. So for me, it's a level of success from 12, 13 years ago to when I moved back to Nigeria to now. Also, what has worked is the not too young to run bill. The old guys weren't trying to let the young folks take over their seats. Right now, you have the youngest speaker, 35, is also the youngest conference of speaker in Nigeria. That's what is working. Advocacy is working in Nigeria. Also, the not too young to run bill have said that, more importantly, openness. Advocacy is working in Nigeria. It might look like you're not winning the big battle, but believe me, every day, because I knew what it took for the 8th Assembly to open their budget to let you know where 110 billion was going to 400, 500 people. Senators that have been there, legacy senators, fought back on it. But they couldn't hide after a while because their kids, their wives, their concubines, and we're always reminding them, you need to make this thing open. So it goes back to it, that the biggest thing working is office of the citizen. We must continue to push for that. And going back to coups in Africa, same thing. I was having a conversation earlier in one of the meetings I went to, and the first coup is stealing of the ballot. Stealing the votes of the people is the first coup. Not to say we support the military coup, but if you do not let the people vote their choice, select their choice, change the rule of the game through an election, there are consequences, or there should be consequences. There should be democratically resolved consequences. But now that goes back to the justice system. So now, the judiciary, we need to continue to garbage in, garbage out. Make sure the quality of education, the orientation of the people that sits on this bench as judges is checked from the beginning. Then also, what was a lot of questions. So I think one question I really actually wanted to touch base on is, how do we go about investing in Nigeria and Africa? Nigeria is open for business. And I belong to a different political party from the current president, but I have faith in some of the guys that have been selected to be the ministers. One of them is the Minister of Digital Economy. I believe that, Bosun Young chap is going to create a lot of innovative ideas. Also in my state, in Osun State, very agri-friendly, so I'll definitely get your number and see how we can at least invite you over. One of the things we're trying to do is create a digital space where you can see the business opportunities available for you in the state. And the state is also creating an enabling environment that makes sure right in the office of the governor, we updrive the process. Before you come to Nigeria, the ease of doing business, getting your visa on arrival, making sure your transportation from Lagos to Osun, your business registration, making sure your farm inputs, but what we are demanding is local content. The entire value chain of agriculture is what we want. We don't just want investors to come and take the mineral resources and go and produce it. We produce cocoa in Osun State. We need to have a chocolate factory in Osun State as well, the entire value chain. So businesses interested in building an entire value chain and reverse integration, totally welcome. We will support you, make sure the process is fast, transparent, and you will get your investment back. Thank you.
Thank you for that great pitch for business for Nigerians. I hope those from Kenya, from other places, will also pitch their businesses at the end when they open up the deal room. Samson.
Yes, Marino, there are cases where things have actually worked. Yes, citizens' action has worked. But if you look at the pandemic response, the community spirit and the power of innovation that was demonstrated by Africans, producing face masks, it's something that's actually working. And so you can see how in some countries institutions actually responded. And the world had to look to Africa in some cases, even though they were deploying and sending some materials to Africa. One other thing that has worked is if you look across the continent, although there's one president who said he wants to run for fourth term, which I have problems with, and it's my personal view, but if you look at that country, you still see a semblance of functional institutions. And if you look at how power has been decentralized, you'd also see how the state is able to galvanize citizens to make contributions to government policies. So look at local governance in a country like Rwanda. In a country like South Africa, there are also decentralized forms of decision-making, and that has also really worked. We've also seen the judicial system, also work in some cases. Malawi was one. Kenya is also one. We've seen these institutions with their robustness able to hold leaders to account. Although one bad example is, well, you can say South Africa, where the Office of the Public Prosecutor did, prosecute former President Jacob Zuma. But a few months down the line, the dude is coasting and is enjoying himself somewhere. But to a large extent, we've seen our judicial systems in some countries actually hold leaders to account, and they've also upheld justice. So there are pockets, there are pockets of effectiveness and good stories on the continent.
Thank you so much. Chinonye, please.
Oh, wow, do I get the closing word? No pressure. What has worked, in my opinion, in my observation, it is purely the African spirit of resilience, the African spirit of mess around and find out, the African spirit of what we call in Nigeria the coconut head generation, that they don't joke, they don't play. That's Rini's generation. That has worked, and I've seen that not just in Nigeria, I've seen that across countries all on the continent. There is a new breed, and I know that I guess we've called it the idea whose time has come. I think the only visualization I can give is whack-a-mole. I don't know if you guys know the game whack-a-mole, where you hit one pops up here. You hit one, pops up here. That is the African spirit of, we're not giving up. So you can't suppress an idea whose time has come, and that is the new breed of Africans who are filled with the spirit of, we're not taking this anymore. We don't see the dividends of democracy that we were promised. We don't see the dream that you promised us. And so we're challenging the old guard, we're challenging the status quo, we're holding institutions to account, we're reading our constitutions, we're reading these documents. I loved observing elections across the continent and seeing some of our partners mobilize around those elections, and they held civic education programs, they held election awareness workshops, they helped voter registration, they queued up and they stayed in line for hours. Some spent days preparing, helping people register. That's the African spirit, and that's what I've seen. So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I hear a lot, the African spirit of resilience, the office of the citizens, and I'm going to round up with that. But before I do, Africa Policy Conversations and the Venn Center has partnered together to work on this. One thing we want to do, somebody in the first panel talked about lots of conversations. We just don't want to have conversations. We want to leave here with recommendations. We want to leave here with what next can we do as institutions, as individuals. And I ask my panelists in 1 minute to just tell us, what is that thing these two organizations should think about as they think about the next level for next year? I'll start with you, Chinonye, this time.
So, action?
Yes, recommendations,
policy
recommendations, and how do we then, as we think about strong institutions, as we think about good governance, transparency, accountability, what is that thing we should look at as institutions?
Okay, institutions need to understand that the time for transparency is now. You have, again, access to information. We're holding conversations on X and Clubhouse. The time for transparency is now. The time where you could sort of close your books and hide and keep information a secret, the time is gone. You have awesome organizations like Budget, Tracker that are really democratizing access to information about public funds and all that. So in terms of policy, you're better off being transparent now because this generation, they'll find out. They'll find out.
Transparency.
Yeah.
So if Africa Policy Conversations and Event Center comes to you for funding for transparency, you will. Thank you for telling us that. Samson.
I think we often assume that people who hold public offices have the answers to all the questions, and they actually don't. And so my sort of recommendation is to both Africa Policy and the Vance Center to think about teasing out some of the actions and the proposals that have come from this and engage the people who have the power to make decisions. And tied to that is, if you're going to do this next year, then the real people who are not part of this choir, and that's those people who make most of the decisions, they also have to be here. It's good we have banks here, but we need to have more of those decision makers in this space. So let's get to interact with them and push some buttons. And the last point for me will be that a few weeks ago, one of the former presidents of Gabon, in a very funny and ridiculous video, called on Africans to make noise. I don't know how many of us saw that.
Yeah.
We said we should make noise. And I just want to flip that it is time to make noise for Africa's redemption. And it's a redemption from exploitative local elites, as well as some foreign powers that have continually held Africa hostage. So that is the noise we need to make. And I think the Vance Center and Africa Policy have provided this space for us to make that noise for Africa redemption. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So make noise.
Make the noise. Make it at the local level. Don't wait till election. See, I'll tell you this. Politicians across all parties in all countries are scared of the people. Once you understand that, you understand the power that you have, then why not make that noise? Make the noise enough that as they approach election in the next 3 years, at least I speak for Nigeria, and this covers Africa as well, and the country that the president wants to run for 4th term. If a noise is made, I feel the president that wants to run for the 4th term will find one of his mentees that can take over. Not to say that's the best approach, but at least we start to see some semblance of change. Make noise, understanding the fact that because you can win an election by rigging, by bribing, doesn't mean you can govern. And when they understand that the citizens can make it ungovernable for them, they will give you better choices. So when you have better choices for election, hopefully we get better outputs. So yes, make noise, make the right noise. Next time, invite people that can not only make change because they are there right now, people that have the prospect in the next election to be there to take these policies and enact them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mayura.
I wonder what country, this country that shall not be named, that we keep talking about, but I was reflecting a little bit on the conversation that we've had. And I think maybe just 2 or 3 things I would say, just in addition to what the panelists have said. I think the first one is just one, who are institutions? Institutions are made up of you and I, right, people. And I think someone mentioned the office of the citizen. So maybe one thing for you guys to think about is how do you actually help across the continent mobilize the office of the citizen and capacitate enough in a smart way for us to make noise that is heard, right? You want to make noise that is coherent, you want to make music, you want to make noise that actually leads to action. So how can you actually capacitate that? So that's one. The second question, or the second thought I had as I thought about this nameless country, is also, what are we doing to ensure succession planning in our countries, right? What are we doing to make, because this is something, again, that is, I guess, something that we think about a lot in the corporate world. But when you think about these countries that have strong men, I always ask, who's going to replace them? And how are we ensuring that there's right succession planning in those countries and in the institutions that we're talking about, to make sure that, again, when there's a change of power, it doesn't lead to chaos. So that's another thing that I would also talk about. And the third for me is just ensuring that, we don't seem helpless. I think there was a lady there that, talked about, corporate chronism, capture, and all of that. But don't underestimate, I have to borrow from Chinaya, an idea whose time has come. And don't underestimate the power that you have. Don't underestimate the power that you have to effect change, right? And so that's maybe for all of us in the room, not to just sit down and think, oh, yet another election has passed, or, yet something else has happened, yet another coup, or yet we have the power to effect change, and it's in our hands. So again, a charge for us in the room, what can we do to see the institutions that we want across Africa?
Thank you so much. I sincerely apologize for extending this panel beyond the time, but I think we've had very wonderful and great discussions. We'll end by saying that if we must, as Africans, work to promote access to justice, good governance, transparency, accountability, and ease of doing business, as we heard from our panelists today, we need to activate our African spirit of resilience, mobilize the office of the citizenry, which is every one of you in this room. So feel free to reach out to us. We are looking for partnership. We want to partner with you. We don't want to think we can do it alone. And we know every one of you in this room has got a strength, has got a network, has got something to offer. So let's activate that and partner together to do this more. Thank you so much to my panelists. It's been wonderful listening to you. I've been taking notes. Thank you so much, everybody, for having us. Thank you.